Hello everyone, and welcome to this audio podcast. As part of this this Dominopostics production, this is an audio podcast. As part of the an audio podcast as part of the Phelemonix Clax charter. Is the Clax charter v.2. And I thought what I'd do is provide a sort of an overview in regards to two main particular focuses nephrology, in and around aspects surrounding nephrology, laboratory medicine, and pathology. And one is one will be in and around sort of the new new or novel creatinine and cystatin C based equations to estimate glomerular filtration rate without race, and the second sort of the second sort of top aspect and overview that I will seek to provide will be in and around works that's been generally quite important and topical in and around in and around aspects of solid organ transplantation, and also aligned to the use of different calculations to determine renal functions. And this particular topic will be in and around works that's been was published in was published in 2012. So although quite a little bit of an older piece, older works, the topic is still very important, and that is in and around worldwide variability in deceased organ donation registries. And so what I'm going to do with these particular focuses is actually highlight how they are important in synchronicity. And so in doing this, I'm going to highlight these works in overview by sort of reading or referring to the abstracts of both of two different particular papers, publications, and then highlighting how they are important sort of in how they're important in sort of conjunction with one another. So there's works first and foremost, works by a team who published works in and around new creatinine and cystatin C based equations to estimate glomerular filtration rate without race. And this work was published in the New England Journal of Medicine in November 2021. And I highlight this work or provide sort of an overview in and around this work since at the American Society of Nephrology this year in 2022, there were various various works and research that highlighted how how might eliminating race-based sort of calculations and equations to determine renal function may affect or could affect the weight for those who are on sort of transplant sort of waiting lists. And so I thought I'd highlight this works in particular that came from that had been published by Inca and team in 2021, and so they highlight that current equations for estimated glomerular filtration rate, or eGFR, that use serum creatinine or cystatin C incorporate age, gender, and race to estimate measured glomerular filtration rate. However, race in estimated glomerular filtration rate equations have been referred to in some contexts as a social and not a biological construct. The methodology in around this works was that they developed new estimated glomerular filtration rate equations without race using data from two development data sets. There were 10 investigations, 10 studies, where, for example, 8,254 participants, wherein 31.5% were black, for serum creatinine and 13 studies, 5,352 participants, 39.7 were black, and for both serum creatinine and cystatin C as well. In a validation data set of 112 investigations, 40,050 and 50 participants, 14.3% were black, and they compared the accuracy of new estimated glomerular filtration rate equations to measured glomerular filtration rate. And the team projected the prevalence of CKD, chronic kidney disease, and glomerular filtration rate stages in a sample of United States adults using current and new calculations or equations. The results in and around this were that in the validation data set, the current creatinine equation calculation that uses age, gender, and race overestimated. So I'll say that again. It overestimated measured glomerular filtration rate in blacks, and the median, for example, was 3.7 mil per minute per 1.73 meter square of body surface area, 95% confidence interval. And then the works goes on to highlight that when the adjustment for black race was omitted, so for example was not included from the current estimated glomerular filtration rate calculation or equation, measured glomerular filtration rate in blacks was underestimated, and so for example the median 7.1 mil per minute, 7.1 per mil per minute per 1.73 meters squared was identified, and a new equation using age and gender and omitting a race also underestimated underestimated measured glomerular filtration rate in blacks. The median was 3.6 mil per minute per 1.73 meters squared, and overestimated measured glomerular filtration rate in non-blacks, which was median. The median was 3.9 mil per minute per 1.73 meters squared. And for all equations, 85% or more of the estimated glomerular filtration rates for blacks and non-blacks were within 30% of measured glomerular filtration rate. And so the new creatinine and cystatin C equations without race were more accurate than creatinine equations with smaller differences between race groups, as compared with current creatinine equation. The new creatinine equations or calculations, but not new creatinine and cystatin C equations, increased population estimates of chronic kidney disease prevalence amongst blacks, and yielded a similar or lower prevalence in non-blacks. Now, in line with this, I am now going to highlight a little bit more in context of in context by sort of a complementary sort of context that was highlighted in the American Society of Nephrology's Kidney News article, which was published in November 2022. And basically here they say recognizing the race is a social and again a social and not a biological construct. Several healthcare institutions no longer report patients' renal function through estimated glomerular filtration rate or eGFR equations or calculations that have an adjustment for black race. The American Society of Nephrology and the National Kidney Foundation had endorsed this move, and a new set of race-free equations to estimate glomerular filtration rate and a new set of race-free equations to estimate glomerular filtration rate was again published in 2021, and part of the abstract of what I just highlighted was works that was published in 2021. November 2021. So new research had been published in the journal known as the Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology, examines the impact of using these new calculations or equations on renal kidney transplant on renal or kidney transplant recipients who are on solid organ transplant lists. And so the investigation looked specifically at how these new equations may affect patients not yet treated with different forms of renal replacement therapy, and can begin to be sort of disadvantaged in a sense, where, for example, as a default, they could be waiting longer in line for a solid organ transplant. However, that being said, at the same time, the estimated glomerular filtration rate is historically or retrospectively has been the primary calculation an equation to determine eligibility for those who are in sort of that sort of basis where, for example, they have renal insufficiency, but also where, for example, they along with sort of healthcare professionals can be sort of can have sort of particular laboratory investigations alongside glomerular filtration rate or estimated glomerular filtration rate to actually determine alongside renal insufficiency, but also allow them allows professionals to ensure that patients are appropriately listed on the transplant waiting list in context of having being prepped for a transplant as well at the same time. And so in this particular article, complementary to the works that I just highlighted as well, this works highlights, or this article highlights as well that the calculations allow health professionals to determine eligibility on the transplant on solid organ waiting lists, and also where that as a default some patients some patients may as a default be waiting longer, and a cure time on the solid organ transplant waiting list longer, owing to how historically, in some context, how the calculations may be perceived as disadvantaging as well. That being said, at the same time, here also, according to current national policy, patients can begin to occur a sort of waiting time for transplantation when estimated glomerular filtration rate is less than 20 ml per min, and 1.73 m squared. Now, basically, the less than 20 ml per min and 1.73 meters squared is part of sort of classification and severity according to chronic kidney disease. And there are in previous audio podcasts under Storm Lobostics, listeners may be aware that I have highlighted various forms of various audio podcasts have highlighted the link between severity and classification in context of chronic kidney disease. Now, less than 20 will fall into what would be referred to as chronic kidney disease, or CKD stage 5, or also referred as a terminology referred to as end-stage renal disease, or ESRD, or also recently been updated according to some guidelines, ESKD, or end-stage kidney disease. Now, previously, the investigation studies and investigators highlighted that when using sort of the older equations that included black race, individuals of black race had a shorter time to renal failure or kidney failure, and would theoretically occur a less duration on waiting on lists on the lists. In the current research, and again in sort of complementary to the works that have just been highlighted in context of the abstracts from works that was published in 2021 last year. The investigators wondered whether using a new race free equations to guide preemptive waitlisting or listing would minimize racial differences in a curable preemptive sort of duration on in waiting for a solid organ transplant. The team determined, so this investigation sort of also determined an association between race, black, all white, and time spent with estimated glomerular filtration rate less than 20 ml per min, and using the new race-free creatinine-based or a new race-free cystatin C based equation. In audio podcasts previously, listeners may well be aware that creatinine and cystatin C are both biomarkers used to determine renal function. Creatinine has historically been used. Cystatin C as a biomarker is not it is whilst it is implemented or has been used, it's not as freely used, let's say, as for example creatinine. Now, when using the new race-free creatinine-based equation, time to renal failure or kidney failure was similar between patients of black and white race. However, the time to kidney failure or renal failure was still shorter for patients of black race using the cystatin C based race-free equation. The results suggest, the investigation also suggests that using a race-free creatinine based equation to determine preemptive eligibility in a strategy that may reduce racial differences in access to preemptive wait time accurate. So there's works or sorry there in this article as well. There's understanding from one of the authors of another article from the University of California in University of California in this article, where they highlight where they also highlight quite well that they say that we believe that the findings in the investigation that was conducted was helpful in providing preliminary data on the use on how the use of different glomerular filtration rate estimating equations would theoretically affect the sort of weight the time accrual or time accumulation before to the start to the start of renal replacement therapy, or in this case hemodialysis as a form of renal replacement therapy. And this was highlighted by an academic from the University of California, and where the University of California in San Francisco, and they found also that the new creatinine-based equations seem to be associated with more time with more weight more time waiting, and that could potentially be accrued compared with the use of cystatin C based equation. But the findings require further verification and validation in more substantiated investigations. And there is works also by an academic from the University of Alabama in Birmingham, notes that although a race-free creatinine-based equation for estimated glomerular filtration rate may attenuate racial differences in access to renal transplantation, it is uncertain what consequences there may be from implementation of this particular calculation and formula. And it is uncertain. It's uncertain what consequences there may be from implementing this sort of formula. However, while the number of blacks affected by the use of new formula will be the smallest are actually the smallest population in context of those on forms of renal replacement therapy, in forms of renal replacement therapy, and specifically on hemodialysis initiation and referral for renal transplantation. More blacks will and could be affected at higher estimated glomerular filtration rate thresholds, including renal donor candidacy and post donation and post transplant follow-ups. So there would be a corresponding increase in the present prevalence. So the authors highlight that there could be or would be a corresponding increase in the prevalence of CKD among individuals in the general population who identify as black and may now be excluded, may be and could be excluded from becoming potential renal donors, thus also limiting access to where, for example, in the general population, where there could be where there can be limiting access to actually being recipients in context of living donors from living donation in a population that perceives itself at some already disadvantage. So the authors in this particular article highlight that there are also potential implications for enrollment and conduct of clinical trials, such as fewer outcomes observed in trials where events are more likely to occur in those with lower estimated glomerular filtration rate who may now be excluded. So furthermore, while systematic overestimation among non-blacks has the potential to result in inappropriate drug continuation, particular drugs and particular drug continuation or overdosing for particular medications. Underestimation among blacks may result in drug discontinuation and undergoing and underdosing, including where particular drugs fall in the categories of chemotherapeutics, chemotherapeutic agents, and also other particular categories. The works around this particular article can be identified as works by Ku and team from 2021, where it's a comparison of 2021 CKD EPI equations for estimating racial differences in preemptive waitlisting for kidney transplantation, and it was published in the clinical. This article was published in, this was published in the Clinical Journal of American Society of Nephrology, and there's works that was published by Reed and Locke, highlighted Reed and Locke, where they published works on reducing racial disparities in access to transplant in the United States, the works was published in the Clinical Journal, Clinical Journal of the American Society of Nephrology. The works that I highlighted initially have been published in the New England Journal of Medicine in 2021, and the author is Inca and team in 2021. The works is highlighted as a CKD epidemiology collaboration, and this is this works was it was published as the new creatinine and cystatin C based equations to estimate glomerular filtration rate without race, and the full paper is can be identified through a search engine online. The overall conclusion that Inca and team highlight in context of the article by the American Society of Nephrology, alongside the other authors that have been mentioned in this in it as well, is that new estimated glomerular filtration rate equations that incorporate creatinine and cystatin C but omit race are more accurate and led to smaller differences between black participants and non-black participants than new equations without race. with either creatinine or cystatin C alone. Again, the methodology around this work is quite is generally analytical and statistical. However, the abstract of this work is pretty pretty gives a pretty good overview around the importance of the count the authors give a pretty good overview around the calculations and equations in around these biomarkers that are used. And so in line with this and this sort of overview, I now want to highlight a little bit in around